What if everything you've been told about justice was filtered through silence, power, and fear? What if the cries of a people buried under rubble and history finally echoed through the highest court in the world? And this time, the world listened? This is not just another speech. This is a moment of reckoning. For over 75 years, a nation stood accused of occupation, of apartheid, of relentless brutality, and the world kept debating. But now, the gavel has fallen. The International Court of Justice has declared what many were too afraid to admit. Israel is an illegitimate state under international law. But what does this really mean? Why does it matter now more than ever? And what comes next? For Palestine, for justice, for all of us. In the next few minutes, we will journey through truth buried by politics, history erased by propaganda, and a global order finally being forced to choose between power and principle. Stay with me till the end, because by the time we finish, you won't just understand the verdict, you'll feel its weight. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to be part of the justice the world can no longer deny. The International Court of Justice's declaration that Israel is an illegitimate state did not emerge in a vacuum. It is the culmination of decades of historical, legal, and geopolitical context that have shaped one of the most protracted and painful conflicts of the modern era. From the moment Israel was established in 1948, its legitimacy was questioned by many states and legal scholars due to the nature of its founding, which involved the mass displacement of Palestinians, an event known as the Nakba. Over 750,000 Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, and hundreds of villages were destroyed. While Israel was quickly recognized by several Western powers, many in the international community saw its birth as inseparable from a colonial process that disregarded indigenous rights and self-determination. The ICJ, in reaching its decision, took into account the historical roots of Israel's creation, but more importantly, its behavior since. The state's continued expansion into Palestinian territories, most notably through illegal settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, has long been declared in violation of international law by multiple UN resolutions. The ICJ examined decades of these violations, from home demolitions to the blockade of Gaza, and determined that Israel had continuously acted outside the boundaries of accepted international norms. These aren't isolated incidents. They form a pattern of systematic oppression and land seizure. Furthermore, the court considered the Israeli government's legal frameworks that give unequal rights to Jews and Palestinians, both within its borders and in the occupied territories. This two-tiered system was cited as evidence of an apartheid regime, further invalidating the claim that Israel functions as a democratic and lawful state. The court scrutinized not just military actions, but policies, laws, and the lack of due process for Palestinians. These cumulative findings led to the historic conclusion that the very structure and continued operation of the Israeli state violate the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and customary international law. By declaring Israel's statehood as illegitimate, the ICJ has not simply issued a verdict on the nation's policies, but questioned the very foundation upon which it was built. The ruling places Israel outside the legal and moral community of nations until it undergoes fundamental changes that align with international justice. The International Court of Justice's ruling against Israel emphasized a long-standing pattern of violations against international law and basic human rights, which formed the legal foundation for declaring the state illegitimate. Central to the court's judgment were Israel's repeated breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which protects civilians in times of war and under occupation. The ICJ highlighted how Israel's continued settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem directly violates Article 49 of the Convention, which prohibits the transfer of an occupying power's civilian population into the territory it occupies. These settlements are not only illegal, but serve as instruments of land theft, demographic manipulation, and cultural erasure, pushing the indigenous Palestinian population into fragmented enclaves. Beyond land issues, the court also reviewed Israel's consistent use of excessive force including in Gaza, where civilians have been subjected to collective punishment through a long-standing blockade. The ICJ considered testimonies, UN reports, and verified investigations showing how Israel's airstrikes on hospitals, schools, and homes violated the principles of distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law. Civilian lives were treated as collateral damage in a system that routinely operates with impunity. Such actions, when sustained and systematic, amount to war crimes. The court also condemned the discriminatory legal structure imposed by Israel, particularly the application of military law to Palestinians, while Israeli settlers in the same region are governed by civilian court. This dual system undermines the principles of equality before the law and violates numerous articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Palestinians live under curfews, checkpoints, home demolitions, and arrest without trial, all of which constitute serious human rights abuses under international law. In assessing the broader implications, the EG made clear that a state cannot maintain legitimacy if its very existence is predicated on the systemic denial of another people's rights. Israel's refusal to comply with decades of UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, its failure to respect the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and its routine disregard for international judicial bodies all point to a nation operating outside the legal framework that binds the global community. These ongoing violations are not simply diplomatic failures. They are criminal acts that erode any claim to lawful statehood or moral authority on the international stage. The International Court of Justice's declaration of Israel as an illegitimate state served as a turning point for the Palestinian struggle, not only legally but morally and emotionally across the world. For over 75 years, Palestinians have endured occupation, displacement, and apartheid while their voices were often dismissed, censored, or vilified in global narratives. This ruling finally gave weight and authority to what Palestinians have been saying for generations, that their suffering is not just a political matter, but a clear-cut case of justice denied under the rule of international law. For many Palestinians, this was the first time that the highest legal body on earth not only heard their cry, but validated their historical and lived reality with a verdict grounded in fact, law, and humanity. This judgment did more than just expose Israel's violations. It empowered the global solidarity movement, activists, human rights organizations, and student-led campaigns that have long stood in support of Palestine now carry the legal authority of the IC behind their advocacy. Movements such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, which have faced smear campaigns and censorship, find renewed credibility and energy from this verdict. The ruling is not just a legal instrument, it is a moral megaphone. It echoes through the streets of Gaza, the refugee camps of Lebanon, the classrooms of Europe, and the parliaments of Latin America. The people who marched, protested, and resisted through art, culture, and truth now stand with a stronger foundation. The psychological impact of this decision is just as significant. For decades, Palestinians were told to accept occupation as normal, to accept checkpoints, blockades, and humiliation as part of everyday life. But the IC Declaration breaks that narrative and affirms that their resistance is not only justified, it is necessary. It asserts that Israel's power does not equal justice, and silence in the face of injustice will no longer be protected under diplomatic immunity. This has also awakened a larger global audience to the realities on the ground. People who once stood on the sidelines are now beginning to understand that neutrality in the face of oppression is complicity. The court's decision draws a legal and moral line, and more voices are choosing to stand on the side of justice. The ruling gives the Palestinian struggle what it always deserved: international legitimacy and undeniable truth in the eyes of the world. The International Court of Justice's declaration against Israel represents a powerful shift in how legitimacy is defined on the global stage. For too long, legitimacy was measured by military strength, diplomatic alliances, and economic leverage rather than the rule of law and moral responsibility. Israel, backed by powerful Western nations, operated with virtual immunity despite countless violations of international norms. Its actions, including illegal settlements, targeted killings, the blockade of Gaza, and the unequal treatment of Palestinians, were condemned by UN bodies and human rights organizations, yet rarely led to meaningful consequences. This ruling redefines legitimacy not as a product of political muscle, but as a result of lawful conduct and adherence to global standards of justice. The ICJ decision sends a clear message that no state, regardless of its strategic alliances or influence, can place itself above the law. It challenges the long-standing Western hypocrisy that punishes some nations harshly for minor infractions while shielding others who commit systemic human rights violations. By calling into question the legal foundations of Israel's existence, the ICJ has shifted the narrative from political debate to legal accountability. This forces countries to reevaluate their alliances, their moral standing, and their participation in systems that enable injustice. It is no longer politically or morally defensible to support a state that has been declared illegitimate under international law. This shift is especially critical in a world that is growing more conscious of justice, equality, and historical truth. Younger generations, movements for decolonization, and global citizens increasingly demand consistency between values and action. The ruling empowers these voices, giving them not just a moral argument, but a legal foundation upon which to stand. It affirms that the struggle for Palestinian liberation is not an isolated cause. It is part of a broader fight to ensure that international law is applied universally, without exception. The decision also forces international institutions, human rights courts, and governments to confront their complicity. It exposes the uncomfortable truth that many of them stood by or even enabled decades of occupation and abuse. It strips away the narrative of neutrality and reveals the deep imbalance in how justice has been administered globally. The IC Declaration reclaims the authority of international law as a tool not just for the powerful, but for the oppressed, and challenges every nation to choose whether they stand with legal truth or political convenience. The International Court of Justice's declaration that Israel is an illegitimate state has sparked a global wave of contrasting reactions that reveal deep divisions in international politics, morality, and accountability. In many regions of the world, especially across the global south, the ruling has been embraced as a long overdue recognition of Palestinian suffering and resistance. Countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East have largely celebrated the decision, viewing it as a correction of historical injustice and a bold step toward dismantling the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. For these nations, the IC decision is not just about Palestine. It symbolizes a rejection of the double standards that have governed international affairs for decades. On the other hand, powerful Western nations, particularly those with long-standing political, military, and economic ties to Israel, have either rejected or ignored the ruling. Statements from officials in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and others framed the ICJ verdict as biased or politically motivated, choosing to uphold Israel's right to exist despite overwhelming legal evidence to the contrary. These reactions reveal the entrenched interests that override human rights concerns when it comes to strategic alliances. Such denial also exposes the deep hypocrisy in how international law is applied. These same countries invoke legal principles when justifying action against nations like Russia, Iran, or North Korea, but dismiss them entirely when it comes to Israel. This division has created a moral crisis within international institutions, highlighting their vulnerability to political pressure. The ICJ, meant to stand above geopolitical games, is now caught in the crossfire of global powers that pick and choose which laws they support. Public reactions have mirrored this split. In many Western cities, mass protests erupted, either in defense of the ICJ's decision or in outrage at their government's refusal to accept it. Universities, civil rights organizations, and human rights groups have voiced support for the court's ruling, while mainstream media coverage has ranged from cautious reporting to outright suppression of the verdict's details. These polarized reactions illustrate the core issue at stake, whether international law is a universal standard or a tool of convenience. The ruling has not only exposed Israel's legal and moral failures, but has also put a spotlight on the countries that enable those failures. It has forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about complicity, silence, and the true meaning of justice in the international order. The International Court of Justice's ruling declaring Israel an illegitimate state does not in itself bring an immediate end to the occupation or the suffering of the Palestinian people, but it has opened a historic legal and moral door that cannot be closed again. This decision, while powerful, is symbolic unless followed by meaningful global action. The responsibility now shifts to the international community, governments, civil society, human rights organizations, and everyday people to transform this legal milestone into a movement of accountability. The ICJ has spoken, but it is the global response that will determine whether justice will finally be realized or whether this ruling will be buried under political compromise and media silence. Accountability begins with enforcement. The court's decision should compel the United Nations to take concrete steps, whether through sanctions, international arrest warrants for those responsible for war crimes, or full recognition of Palestinian statehood. Countries that have long hidden behind neutrality must now choose a side, because silence is no longer a shield. It is complicity. The ruling also gives legal weight to grassroots movements like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, empowering them to pressure institutions and corporations to sever ties with Israel's apartheid infrastructure. Universities, investors, and cultural institutions now have a legal basis for disengagement, and doing so becomes not just an ethical choice, but a moral obligation under international law. The decision also presents an opportunity for Palestinians to build new diplomatic and legal strategies grounded in the court's findings. It allows them to reframe their cause not just as a political struggle, but as a demand for enforcement of international law and human rights. Activists, lawyers, and governments aligned with justice can now work through legal bodies to pursue reparations, criminal accountability, and recognition for decades of suffering. This is the moment to translate moral outrage into organized, sustained action that cannot be ignored. None of this will happen on its own. The ICJ ruling is a tool, a powerful one, but tools require hands that are willing to build. This moment calls for courage, clarity, and commitment from all corners of the world. It is no longer enough to be sympathetic or informed. The path to justice lies in sustained global action, legal follow-through, and unrelenting pressure on those who have enabled impunity for far too long. Today, the world has been handed a mirror by the International Court of Justice, one that reflects not only the pain of a people long oppressed, but the moral failing of a system that let it continue for generations. The declaration that Israel is an illegitimate state is not just a legal judgment, it is a turning point. It is the voice of international law finally echoing the cries of Palestinians who were told for too long that justice was a distant dream. This ruling exposes decades of lies, unearths buried truths, and redefines what legitimacy truly means, not by might, but by morality, not by power, but by principle. But a verdict alone does not change the world. It is the fire it sparks within us that does. This is the moment for nations to rise above politics, for people to act beyond silence, and for justice to move beyond the courtroom and into every corner of our conscience. The court has spoken, history has shifted, and now it's on us to carry the truth, to defend the oppressed, and to never let justice be delayed again. Thank you for standing here with your heart open and your mind ready to hear the truth. May your voice never tremble when you speak for the voiceless, and may your actions always rise to meet the weight of justice. Good luck on this journey, and never forget, real change begins the moment we refuse to be silent.